Hello and welcome. This is Gerald here again. Just thought I'd put together this new tutorial video on how to take three bracketed exposures and use Photoshop's merge to HDR Pro to convert them into a 32-bit HDR file that we can then reconvert back into 16-bit in order for one to then carry forward for further post-processing and development. Now, this is another approach that you can take, which I must admit I have started to introduce a lot more into my workflow. Because normally what I would do the tried and trusted thing of taking three bracket exposures, loading them into Photoshop layers, then blending them together manually by hand using luminosity masks or layer masks, etc., etc., etc. This is a different approach to basically let the computer and software do it for you, as opposed to the other two sort of leading brands or third-party HDR processing software that's on the market, namely Photomatix and Nik's HDR Effects Pro. Personally, I just don't use those because I've never been particularly happy with the end result, no matter how much futzing and fine-tuning. I find that they just bring in too many other kind of like noise-related artifacts, whether it's luminance noise, color noise, etc., etc., etc. But again, that's just me. But what this will do will basically create a tonally balanced end result, but without the introduction of all those other kind of anomalies that those particular brands of software tend to introduce. So let's have a quick look here at what we've got. And as you can see here, I have a scene of multiple exposures of a place that I was just up the other day. I set the camera into aperture priority. I had an aperture of f11. I set it to auto bracket, so what the camera did was I just pressed my cable release and it automatically fired off these three exposures. One on what it calculated to be on exposure, which was 1/400th of a second. It then shot one at one stop under exposure, and then it then fired off one stop over exposure. What this is actually doing, I mean, let's look at this one here. I mean, this is the whole principle of HDR, and I'm assuming that you do understand the whole concept of HDR. It's not done a bad job, but obviously, as is the case with a lot of particularly photography, outdoors landscape photography, the cameras today still can't beat the human eye for discerning a properly balanced tonal range with any given scene. So here, I mean, the foreground is not too bad. It's quite nicely exposed, but you can see here, obviously, you know, I'm losing a lot of detail in the highlights, and it's blowing out in the sky. Consequently, you know, if I was to then try to compensate for that in terms of getting all that detail back in the sky, then obviously, you know, the foreground is going, you know, quite underexposed and dark and murky. So basically, this is the principle of HDR. It's combining these three exposures to give a extended range, tonal range in any given image. So anyway, so let's start cracking on with this. Now, what I need to do prior to sending it off into Photoshop to do this processing is that I need to take these into Adobe Camera Raw to make some quite critical global adjustments to them even prior to doing that. Now, if you're using Lightroom, what I'm about to do throughout the entirety of this video, you will be able to do it in Lightroom, because my workflow, I use Bridge, I use Adobe Camera Raw, then into Photoshop. If you're using Lightroom, everything I'm about to do here, both in Bridge and in Adobe Camera Raw, you can do in Lightroom in terms of the adjustments we're going to make. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all three of these exposures, and you can do one of two things. You can either press Command R, or I think that's Control R, to open them up into Adobe Camera Raw, or you can just double click on them, and which is what I'm going to do now. And here all three have loaded into Adobe Camera Raw. Now what I'm going to do is, for the first instance, I'm just going to click up here and select all. I'm going to go over to this icon here, which is lens corrections, and I'm going to click on two important buttons. I'm going to enable the lens profile correction, which basically Adobe Camera Raw is going to read the metadata from my camera and figure out what lens I'm using and compensate for any either pin or barrel distortion that the camera picked up through the lens. I'm then going to click on this tab here, and I'm going to remove the chromatic aberration from all three images because they're all selected. Now the chromatic aberration, if you don't know, you should know about this because this is a very, very important thing to remove from your raw files, is the cyan and magenta haloing that can appear around edges, particularly in very, very high contrast situations like things against, say, like these twigs or things against the sky. You will notice this cyan magenta fringing, and that's because of light diffraction in the lens. And unless you're paying, multiple thousands of dollars for a high-end Zeiss lens, most lenses are going to create some form of chromatic aberration. Now, Adobe Camera Raw and I think Lightroom do an excellent job in just removing that, analyzing the image and removing it. And obviously all I need to do here is just click on the remove chromatic aberration button, and it's going to remove that chromatic aberration from each one. Now you can see that these are being updated because these three thumbnails now have got this small icon, which is indicating that settings are now being applied to these particular images. Right, so the next port of call will be these two triangular, which is the detailing tab. And what I want to do is I want to increase my noise reduction, my luminance noise reduction, to anywhere between 40 or 50, because these are 16-bit files, so there's a lot of information there. So I tend to err on, you can raise that up quite high for this first go around, just to kind of make sure you're eliminating any kind of embedded noise, and also kind of come down to color here. And I'm actually going to whack that right over to 100 because again at this stage it's not going to have any detrimental effect in terms of any loss of detail, but it is going to make sure it's going to kind of knock out as much noise, color noise, that's in these images. And what I want to now do is to go into kind of like some global automations, because what I'm doing, this red here is indicating that I do have highlight clipping. Which is not surprising since I'm shooting right into this. Now I'm going to click on this particular thumbnail. These are not all selected now. I'm just targeting this particular exposure, and I'm going to just come over to my highlight slider here, and I'm just going to start reducing that just so until that red fully disappears, which means I don't have any clipping there. That's right, so let's just change that. I'm now going to come over to the dark exposure. Yeah, I've still got a little bit of clipping in there, so I just want to remove. So I've got some information in there, and it's not just clipping to straight white. And the overexposed, the one over, it's debatable whether or not you might need to remove it. I tend to do it just to be on the safe side. So as I say, I know that I've got tonal information in that very bright part, and yeah, that looks like it's pretty much done. And again, these are now all updated. So all I need to do now is to just exit Adobe Camera Raw by just coming down to the bottom here, furthest button on the right, just hit done. We now go back to Adobe Bridge. You will now see that these raw files have now been updated, and you can tell that by, again, they've had this little circular icon applied to them. So now with these in this state, we can now send these off to through to Photoshop in order for it to start working its magic in terms of combining these all into one composite 32-bit file. So in order to do that, I just need to shift click to select all of them, come up under Tools, come down to Photoshop, and go into select Merge to HDR Pro. Now, so at this juncture, there might be quite a bit of a wait, depending on how ramped up your machine is or how powerful it is, because there's a lot going on underneath the hood here. And I'm not going to make you sit through all this, but basically what Photoshop is now doing, it's going through each image and it's analyzing it and it's putting it into its own layer, and it's going to do quite a little bit more work. And once it's done that, it's then going to open up into the HDR dialog box, and then we can pick it up there. As I say, I'll probably cut it here because I'm sure you've got better things to do than just watching this little thing go round and round. Right, here we are. After it's been thinking about it for quite a little bit of time, this dialog box then opens up, and what it basically consists of is these are our three exposures, and it's showing that this is the one over, this is the one that was on exposure, and this is the one under. Now, depending on whether or not this is the first time you're going to be doing this, or the last time you use this may dictate what dialog box you're going to be seeing up over here. By default, when it first opens up or you first do this particular process, it'll open up in 16-bit mode, which is why you're seeing all these sliders here. What we need to do is now just change this over to 32-bit mode, and you'll notice that everything pretty much goes away, and you may actually be kind of pretty disappointed, or your heart may sink when you suddenly see what's on screen, because don't despair. All that's happening is that this kind of like starts to look pretty weird, because unfortunately, present day monitors can't actually render and show you what a proper true 32-bit image is going to look like on screen. So this is kind of your monitor's best guess at what that's going to look like. So what we then need to do is you'll come up to this box here, and you'll see this checkbox here. It will say complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw. Now if this is unchecked, you'll notice that there's this slider underneath here, and no need to worry about that. That's just really a guide for you to see like how much information you've got at both ends of the tonal spectrum. So this is some of the darks. This is obviously, we've got a good amount of information on the midtones, and in the darks, yeah, we've still got quite a lot, and all the way over to kind of like the lights. There's a lot of information in there, which understandably you would imagine, seeing as this is 32 bits. Now let's just check that so that we have the complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw. The other very important thing to do, particularly in this particular shot, I can see right now, as I said, when I was shooting this, although I was bracketing on a bursting, it was just not going to be fast enough to freeze all these little fine grasses or branches in the foreground that was flapping around in extremely high winds, which was going on up here. Similarly with the clouds, in between the exposures, the clouds would have just moved fractionally as they were being pushed very, very quickly across the sky by these immense gusts of wind that were blowing all around. So what we need to do is to come up here, and I advocate checking remove ghosts. And what Photoshop is going to very cleverly do, it's going to go in and analyze, and it is basically going to do that. It's going to remove all the ghosting, and it's going to, freeze these so that there's absolutely no blurring going on, or very, very minimal. And that's something we can check once we've opened this up. So that's pretty much all we need to do. Make sure that we have complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw checked, we've removed ghosts, and all we can do is come down to the bottom right here and click on Tone in Adobe Camera Raw ACR. Now again, this could be another bit of a wait, because there's a lot of heavy lifting that goes on between now and when this opens up on Adobe Camera Raw. Initially, what Photoshop is now doing is going to convert this image into what's known as a smart object. Now if you don't know what smart objects are, I'm not going to spend too much time explaining what they're about. Just get onto YouTube, search for things about how to use and work with smart objects. It's pretty simple. But anyway, let me cut it here, and what we'll do is we'll pick it up again once Photoshop has thought about this and open this up in Adobe Camera Raw. Right, and here we are in Adobe Camera Raw. This is a 32-bit RAW file now in Adobe Camera Raw, and it's at this juncture that we can now make any additional alterations to the tonality of it, drawing on the power of Adobe Camera Raw and the fact that this is a 32-bit image and file that is basically chock full of data and information that will give us tremendous latitude in making any tonal corrections that we want. Say for example, I think that we definitely, reading the histogram and looking at the histogram is going to be really important as part of this. So let's just start by just upping the exposure a little bit here. Okay, this is kind of pushing the highlights a bit, but I can easily recover those by bringing down the highlight slider quite a way, but you can see how much information I'm going to start to be able to recover because again we're drawing on a 32-bit RAW file here now. Looking a little bit dark in here, let's see what happens if we start pulling up the shadows. Just open that up a little bit more, not too much. Really want to try and avoid that kind of like HDR crunch. Now this really is just to kind of get you in the zone. I mean, it's not really a magic bullet in terms of everything's going to be actually tonally pitch perfect or luminance perfect or whatever. But from there, we can look at things like checking on if we want to maybe change the white balance. That's auto. Daylight. It's just going to reduce some of the blue. As I say, we could do quite a bit of work here in Adobe Camera Raw. But as I say, I always want to keep things as vanilla as possible at this stage of the game, because I want to give myself as much latitude and freedom as possible to make further tonal changes, color changes, etc., within Photoshop itself. Now, I was gonna probably actually just bring that exposure down a little bit. It's getting a little bit overexposed there. Maybe bring up these highlights a little bit. Kind of losing a little bit here in these mid-down, but that's okay. I mean, you have to understand the nature of the picture. I mean, I was shooting directly right into the sun, so this is going to go quite dark in here. But again, these are kind of like judgment calls that you have to, aesthetic judgment calls you're going to have to make for yourself. But again, it's done a fantastic job of sharpening and reducing absolutely no ghosting whatsoever on these grasses down here, and also up in the clouds. I mean, it's done a great job of aligning everything into one sharp image. Now, let us say that we're done here, because I kind of am, and I'm just going to click on OK now. And this is actually going to bring this now into Photoshop. Right, we are now in Photoshop, and I just want to bring over the layers panel, because this is kind of important to see what's been going on here. As I say, what Photoshop has done, it has actually turned this image into a smart object. And you can tell that because of this outline bracket and this small tiny icon down here. But what it's also done is it's attached the Camera Raw filter to this image, so that we can actually then round trip back out from Photoshop back into Adobe Camera Raw if we want to make any further tonal corrections or color adjustments or whatever it is. So let me just, to demonstrate, do that. Come down to the Camera Raw filter by the icon, double click on it, and this is now going to round trip this back out into Camera Raw. You can see it's going to Camera Raw filter. It's thinking about it. And here we are, we're back here in Camera Raw if we wanted to make any further changes here. But we don't. I just wanted to show that in terms of demonstration, and it's going to just come back in. Right, so here I've been extolling the virtues of how fantastic this is, and now we've got this super data-rich 32-bit image here. But as is usually the case, what Photoshop gives with one hand, it takes with the other. Now, the unfortunate thing about being in a 32-bit space here is that we are going to be extremely limited to the amount of adjustment layers we're going to be able to apply to this image. It actually cancels out a lot of filters, a lot of adjustment layers won't work in Photoshop in a 32-bit space, which, hey, who knows, maybe in a year or so, maybe it will. But right now, it ain't going to work. And if we go up here under filters, you see virtually all the filters are grayed out. We're very, very limited in terms of what we could do in a 32-bit space actually within Photoshop. Not Adobe Camera Raw, but within Photoshop itself. What we now have to do is we now have to convert this 32-bit image back into a 16-bit image. And what we need to do before we do anything else at this juncture is we need to save this file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save as. And this is actually a very important step. I'm just going to call this HDR test. It does actually, it will say untitled, it'll give you HDR2 as a nomenclature here. Now after the HDR, I am actually going to type in 32_bit master, because I want to make sure that I know that this is the 32-bit master file, and it'll all become clear once I say this, we move on. So let me save this. Now this is going to take a while, because this is going to be around about a 400 megabyte file, because again, as I say, we're in 32-bit, so I hope you got a lot of disk space. Right, well, we've now finally saved our 32-bit version of this image here. Now, what we now need to do is we now need to come up underneath image, and we want to come down to duplicate. Now, it's going to prompt you to give it a name. What we want to name this duplicate is HDR2 16-bit. Click OK. Right, now what we want to do with this 32-bit file that is now the duplicate of the one that we've just been working on, we now need to convert this to 16-bit. And in order to do that, we just come up underneath image, and we come down to mode, and we come down to 16 bits. When we do that, it throws up this dialog box that is saying that reducing the document depth can affect the appearance of layered HDR images. Merge layers before changing depth. And yes, we do want to do that. Now, when we do that, what Photoshop is now going to do, it's now going to give us this dialog box, which is going to start to look a little bit familiar if you've been using Photomatics or Nik HDR effects. Where it's giving you a whole bunch of parameters that you can start changing and moving around, and you know, some of these highly dubious presets that it can come up with, you know, monochromatic, artistic, which basically looks like a dreadful photocopy. Let's not worry about any of this. In fact, this is now counterintuitive to exactly. We don't want any of this. This is the whole point of doing this, because what we need to do now is that we want to maintain the integrity of what this looked like when it was in its 32-bit state. Now, in order to do that, what you need to come up is underneath by the side of method here. Click on method and just select exposure and gamma. And that will preserve the integrity of what this was looking like when it was in its 32-bit state. You press OK. It will do that, and now, lo and behold, we are now working in a 16-bit space. We've still got our very well tonally balanced image that has taken us a fraction of a time to arrive at. You know, instead of, you know, trying to do this all by hand. I'm not knocking that. I mean, it's really great, and I will still do it. But you know, if I'm pushed for time, or you just don't have the time, or basically can be bothered to go through that, this really is a great way to get to this juncture whereby, you know, it's tonally very, very well balanced. You don't have any of this kind of like weird haloing that can come on. You know, you can get with luminosity masking and blending, and you know, burnt edges at the top here where you've been trying to blend a darker exposure into light exposure. You know, it can take a lot of time, and it takes a lot of practice to do that. Is this 100% perfect right now? Probably not, and I'm not claiming it is, and it's not meant to be, but it's just a means to quickly get to a place where we can now start working on this to make a whole myriad changes of whatever we want in terms of tonal balance, color, you name it, because now this is in a 16-bit state. All of our adjustment layers are now open to us. All our filters are back just as it is for normal, because as I say, we've gone from that 32-bit space back into a 16-bit space. Now, as I mentioned before, with the kind of, I say, using kind of a more manual approach to exposure blending, you know, there would be multiple exposures in layers, one on top of the other. It would be masked out so we could brush back in and reveal, you know, the different parts of whatever we want we would bring back in. Now let's just say, supposing that, you know, we want to do the same here. This is why it's so important to have saved this 32-bit version, because what I can now do, say for example I really do want to kind of like open up all the shadow and darkness in this midground area here. Well, what I could do is I could come back into the 32-bit master and round trip back out into Adobe Camera Raw, and really start to pull and open up the exposure, open up the shadows. And the point is, you see, I'm actually doing this, pulling this from a 32-bit image. So any degradation is going to be really, really minimal. If you do need to kind of like, you know, be slightly more extreme in terms of, you know, pulling or pushing the exposure, because as I say, my goal here is to kind of just to open up this. The fact that this is all blowing out is mute. Now I'm just going to, for save time, I'm just going to accept that and say OK. I now need to convert this back into 16-bit just like we did previously. So what I'm now going to do is just come up under Image, Mode, 16-bit. Yep, going to let that merge. I'm going to swap the method to exposure gamma. This is now 16-bit, right? Command C, Command V, bang. That's dropped that in pixel for pixel right on top of that. And I can now do the usual thing that when we're doing this situation, I would Option or Alt click on the Add Layer Mask here to attach a black mask on that to hide this particular layer. I'll get my brush, fairly decent size. I'll make sure that the foreground is set to white. I will choose an opacity of around about 50% by tapping my 5 key. And I'm just going to do this very, very quickly. I'm now going to start, and this is obviously way too hot, bring back more information via this lighter version that we just created in Adobe Camera Raw. Now I'm doing this very, very sloppily. I could have done this by creating a luminosity mask to, you know, for more accuracy, but obviously, you know, I don't want to keep you up here all night. And then, you know, obviously you could make whatever the changes. I'll just reduce the opacity of that layer down just to kind of make it not look too grotesque. But there you have it. The most important thing now is that we need to go back to our 32-bit merge thing, and we need to either go File, Revert to convert it back to its 32-bit state. That can actually take some time. My advice would be I would close this now, and when it prompts me to save the changes, I will say no, don't save changes. So there you have it. That's basically how you can take 3 bracketed exposures, bring them into Adobe Camera Raw for some fundamental global changes to things like chromatic aberration, lens correction, etc. Then use Photoshop's Merge to HDR Pro to create a large, data-rich, information-rich 32-bit file that you can then take, make further tonal adjustments to, then convert back into 16-bit mode that you can then begin working on for further post-production and development in a 16-bit space within Photoshop, and be able to take advantage of all the features within Photoshop. Right, so in terms of just wrapping up, let me just show you where I was able to take that 16-bit image that we created from that 32-bit image in terms of my then ongoing workflow to kind of bring this up to being a much more finished image. Obviously this is kind of what the image looked like, as I say, when it was merged to 32-bit, and as is always the case, it kind of looks, you know, pretty kind of flat. I mean, it's very, very well tonally balanced, but it's, you know, it just doesn't have any kind of sparkle or kind of, you know, contrast. As I say, it looks at a pretty kind of flat, dull image. So as I say, the first port of call was when it opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, would be to apply some tonal and color adjustments. So I'll just switch the filter on. So you can see, you know, what the changes that I made in Adobe Camera Raw once that opened up. So as you can see, I kind of brought it to life a little bit more just by making some kind of, like, you know, overall tonal contrast adjustments and a little bit of clarity, and boosting a little bit of the luminance and the vibrance of the image itself. But then, you know, this was now on a stage to convert into 16-bit and then, you know, bring into Photoshop, or allow me to progress with it is my usual, in terms of my usual kind of like post-processing workflow, in a 16-bit state once made the conversion. And, you know, then I was kind of off and running, and, you know, this is all part and parcel, you know, of my approach and my workflow, which I may make some videos on in the near future in terms of you know, how I kind of get to this kind of stage from a 32-bit image. But anyway, just to kind of like, hopefully show you the possibilities there. And I mean, that's basically, kind of all this video has really been about, is just maybe to give you a different kind of an option and an approach to processing in HDR. If you either don't have Photomatics or you don't have um, Nick HDR Effects Pro or whatever it's called, because obviously this does come bundled and is already exists. If you've got a copy of Photoshop, you immediately have the ability to do this kind of HDR processing. So I think I'll end it here, and once again, thank you very much for watching. Hope this has been of some use and some help, and I'll catch you on the next go round.